Thank you very much for that great paper, Bryony. I'll introduce our third speaker this morning, Dr. Isobel Whitelegg, who is Curator of Public Programs at Nottingham Contemporary. Previously, she was Director of the MA in Curating at Chelsea College of Arts and Design, and the Research Officer and AHRC Fellow with the Research Centre for Transnational Arts, Identity and Nation. In 2005, she completed her PhD at the University of Essex, titled Mira Schendel, Radical Passivity, and has published and lectured extensively on Brazilian and Latin American art ever since. Her published writing has focused on the retrieval of exhibition histories, including research on the gallery Signals in London, as has been mentioned previously. She published Signals, Echoes, Traces in Guy Brett and Luciano Figueiredo's Oiticica in London exhibition catalogue, Tate Publishers. And the Bienal de Sao Paulo, the Bienal de Sao Paulo Unseen, Undone, 1969-1981 in After All, number 22. Her forthcoming project involves an exhibition by the Brazilian artist Geraldo de Barros, which will take place in London at the Photographers Gallery in January 2013. So, Isobel, please. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you very much to Tate and to Tanya in particular for organising this event. As Michael just mentioned, and Tanya before him, I studied Mira Schendel's work in some depth. That was 7 years ago. And the problem at that time, which was quite difficult, was that there was really nobody in London. There was no one to talk to about Mira Schendel's work, with the exception of Guy Brett. It really was at a level of obscurity that has changed extraordinarily over the last 7 years, and was also unseen, which was another frustration. It wasn't physically present, again with the exception of the works that Guy has the gift from Mira from the 60s. So to have 2 days here, another 2 days in Sao Paulo to exclusively talk about the work is sort of like being able to breathe in a way that wasn't possible in writing about her work 7 years ago. My own disclaimer is that for this event, I'm discussing an approach on the work that I really developed at that point, and so I have to apologise for essentially reading a paper. But it is very much focused on a particular series of her works, and it stems from my PhD and from trying to think about the persistence of painting in her work, and distinguishing that from how, at that point, certainly the narrative of her work was presented in exhibition practice. So I will begin and I will read. But I'm beginning departing from this quote, which Schendel wrote in a letter in 1952. "I cannot tell you about my painting. It is not abstract, in inverted commas, but it's abstract in the sense that I believe all of art is." When she made this comment regarding how she considered her painting to be abstract but not abstract, in inverted commas, she was living, as Tanya mentioned, in Porto Alegre and producing painting that was still life, landscape and portraiture, thickly painted in oil on canvas or board. She had already had her first solo exhibition since arriving in Brazil in 1949, and in 1951, one of her paintings, titled Paisagem, Landscape, had been accepted for exhibition at the first edition of the Sao Paulo Bienal. Following her move to Sao Paulo in 1953 and the following decade, this is a work that Tanya showed earlier, her painting does come close to abstraction in inverted commas, and certain of her works do very closely approximate the geometric abstract language of Concretist art, which was prevalent within Sao Paulo at that time. Viewed as a whole, however, Schendel's painting engages abstraction, but I argue retains a consistent relationship to the recognisable image. And I think that you could look again and again at this painting and see it as abstract, but also begin to see it as having a certain relationship to figuration. The group of paintings that I'm interested in here occupy an interstice between abstraction and figuration. Some are attributed the titles paisagem, landscape, or fachada, facade, and each of them reflect a change in texture and tone that's evident in her painting from approximately 1962 onward, as Tanya mentioned earlier. Although Schendel continued to produce painting on canvas and wood intermittently throughout her career, the medium has been either excluded or sidelined from many of the revisions of her practice that emerged internationally after the artist's death in 1988. With the aim of connecting her work to a wider context, a wider Brazilian context, her work has repetitively been considered according to a certain formal development. That is, from the painted picture plane towards the object that occupies a position between 2 and 3 dimensions, and then into space. And this trajectory, which was part of the argument for my thesis, was that essentially her work had been edited according to better-known stories of Brazilian art. So it had gone from painting to the object, into space, and into a sort of participatory, manipulable field, which is clearly a story established by neo-concretism, by artists who are still better known, such as Elio Oiticica and Ligia Clark. And this focus has, and to some extent still does, put certain of her works under more repetitive focus, including the monotypias and the graphic objects, the works that essentially occupy 3-dimensional space, and the transformer vase, which Tanya mentioned earlier. Her movement from painting towards the monotypias is therefore viewed as often as a break with or a dissatisfaction with painting qua painting, and this formal premise precludes a constructive interpretation of her works on canvas. Also, by maintaining a focus, and again I would say this view has changed, but at the time the monotypias in particular were often seen as the monotypia, rather than a series that contains multiple families of image and inscription. So they were viewed in formal terms as something that followed this trajectory from a painting, 2-dimensional painting on canvas towards space, and were often not seen as distinct series or distinct images, but just as a certain type of object. Also, as has been mentioned earlier, one of the very distinct and challenging things about Mira Schendel was her bibliophilia and her appetite for philosophy, which makes her a very enigmatic artist, as Tanya described her, and a difficult one to unpack. She read very widely and often engaged with quite obscure philosophers as well as those that are well known to us, such as Heidegger or Flusser. And the way in which I am interested in her paintings from 63-64 is in how they are interpreted by one of Schendel's partners in dialogue, the theoretical physicist Mario Schenberg. Schenberg's consideration of Schendel's painting took place in 1964, which is a point which is between painting and the monotypias that has become crucial to a formalist historiography of Schendel's work. The fact that Schenberg is familiar with Schendel as a painter also differentiates his view of the monotypias. Rather than him being explicitly concerned with them as a type of object, he's able to approach the monotypias from within painting, so to speak, as sets of images or symbols, as different delineated fields that contain concentrations of specific and meaningful information. His reading sees painting and the monotypias as overlapping and intertwined as, at the time, they were. And in this sense, Mario Schenberg provides a bridge across what has been later presented as a decisive formal rupture. Schenberg's primary profession was as a theoretical physicist. He occupied a senior position at the University of Sao Paulo's Institute for Physics. and his practical achievements as a physicist were outstanding, but he constantly emphasized the intuitive nature of his chosen discipline over its logical structure. He saw science, art, and philosophy as paths that could be held in equivalence, that shared similar concerns and thus contained the potential to become mutually transformative. Since the 1940s, he'd been active as a collector, curator, and critic, and by the 60s was a member of the board of the Sao Paulo Biennale. Like other noted theoreticians of modern physics, notably Heisenberg, Schenberg sought out in his research parallels between the radically altered conception of reality made possible by post-Newtonian physics and the understanding of the world inherent to non-Western ontologies. His reading of Schendel's work was thus informed by a committed interest in Oriental thought and its aesthetic articulation. Schenberg's perspective creates a constructive continuity between the concerns of Schendel's painting, an understanding of the importance of the active void to the monotypias. I use this term as coined and articulated by Guy Brett in relationship to the monotypias and other transparent works. And it's clear from both Schenberg's correspondence with Schendel, but also Guy Brett's correspondence, that a concern with the idea of the void was for Mira Schendel an ongoing philosophical preoccupation. Brett has related his observation that within the monotypias, the empty space and the marking or defining line were equal partners, interchangeable and reciprocal energies, creating one another. He relates this observation to the ontology of sunyata, a central concept within Buddhist and Taoist thought. This is a productive philosophy of emptiness, nothingness, or void. Within philosophical discourse, it's often translated as nihility, in distinction to the Western idea of nihilism. As a precedent for Brett's later interpretation, Schenberg also understood the bordering upon emptiness characteristic of Schendel's 1963 to 1964 painting as a visual exegesis of sunyata emptiness. In line with Schenberg's own stepping beyond the parameters of science into aesthetics, and informed too by the change in possibility inherent to the world as revealed by modern physics, his writing on Schendel's work betrays a will to approach or apprehend that which persists beyond the logical, rational, or apparently necessary consciousness of the world to which Western humanistic thought in particular is in danger of being bound. In this, he was particularly attentive to those of her paintings that approximate landscape, and that for him convey new possibilities of apprehending nature in its incommensurability or otherness from the human. In relation to these paintings, Mario Schenberg is drawn consistently to their reconciliation of abstraction with figuration, a move that reveals for him that the findings of geometric abstraction and concrete art may also return new types of figurative imagery. For Mario Schenberg, the organization of her picture plane is not merely abstract, and neither is it only figurative in a descriptive or mimetic sense. Rather, it seeks to be articulate, to convey a meaningful image which could be taken as analogous with the structuring of vision, language, and thought that is the reflexive ground of our being in and establishing a comprehensible and continuous relationship to the world. Schenberg provides a definition adequate to the pairing of recognizable image and abstract space within such paintings, describing them as ontological landscapes. Not only an aesthetic phenomenon produced by the particularity of certain artworks and techniques, for example, the incorporation of the full blankness of the white page in Japanese Zenga painting, within Oriental ontology, the active presence of nothingness is considered inherent to our experience of the world. Mira Schendel's ontological landscapes become, according to Schenberg's definition, a visual exegesis of the philosophical implications of sunyata as a certain understanding of being. On these terms, sunyata is a standpoint that embraces nothingness as the empty origin that accompanies human existence, whose religiosity is not a separate transcendent above, but an intimate yet incommensurate absolute near side to human existence. It could be identified more simply in relationship to day-to-day existence as the essential unknowability that persists between each person and each other, and between people and or humans and nature. That this group of quasi-landscape works act as an articulation of this idea of emptiness or sunyata is indicated by Mira Schendel's commentary, but his writings do not extend this indication in depth in relationship to particular paintings. And by looking at these works, I want to consider how this kind of relationship articulation might take place. The grouping of works produced between 1963 and 1964 that I'm bringing into discussion is not divided into distinct series. However, within this period, two different modes of semi-abstraction emerge within Schendel's paintings. Those that are indeterminately abstract figurative, and those whose composition places the figurative and the abstract together in a more schematic or diagrammatic relationship. Within the former grouping that I'm identifying, Mira Schendel hints towards the figurative to greater and lesser degrees. In this 1963 work entitled Landscape, for example, the figurative is reduced to the lowest common denominator necessary to create the conditions for the perception of space, namely a horizontal line establishing two differentiated planes of colour. The upper proportion of the canvas are textured black and the lower third white. And I don't know how easy it is to see on the slide. I can kind of see it in front of me on the image on this computer. But there's also a line extending from the horizon upward, a vertical line, which acts as a minimal figure and a subtle focus for the gaze. It might be too subtle for looking on the screen. Can you see it? Can you see the black line? No, shame. In other works, this the line that differentiates two planes of space is vertical, and very often is suggestive of a building's edge or a fence. And this comes across more clearly in supplementary drawings, where there is a more explicit approximation to a built landscape and a minimum sense of architectural detail in the form of windows, doors, and fence edges. In other paintings, the figurative impulse seems to reside within the tone and texture of the painted surface. Schendel often uses a palette that ranges from red earth to dirty brown grey and incorporates soil and earth into the substance of the paint. These surfaces are evocative of outside, earth, mud, concrete, and in this way of both the urban and the natural landscape. The composition of these paintings seems to convey a reflexive perception of exterior space. Within the canvas, this is pure relationship of colour and line, but it is also recognisable form. Line shows how space is initially opened and established, detail where we are in terms of proximity and distance, and tone and material evoke our sensory texturing of such spaces. The recreation of vision within these canvases is more akin to a glance than a gaze, a fragment viewed from the corner of the eye. By limiting her view and variously cropping her composition, Schendel often points to what is behind and beyond our visual field. Subsequently, she creates a boundary between that which is seen and known and that which is simply because we were always related to it, and deforming it into our perception of it, both unseen and unknowable. The cropped composition of these paintings points to the always fuller presence of what is beyond the frame of vision, yet next to it, behind the head or at the edges of the field of vision. Distorting the phenomenal appearance of the outside into a framed image similarly places human perception and knowledge as a reduction, a removal or subtraction from the always fuller unseen or unknown. It seems that in these works we can understand the figure as a profile, as an always partial gaze, one of potentially many cut out from the universal field of blankness and the unknown. It's possible even to interpret this work as a literal idea of the gaze as being subtractive. in this work in which the rectangular shape of two figures are cut out from the ground of a textured white field. Both the fragmentary character of these glances at the landscape and their indeterminate status between representation and abstraction evoke an uncertainty within perception, a dissonance between the earth in and for itself, and a capability of the human world to fully incorporate nature into the known. And this is an understanding that would resonate some way with Mira Schendel's digestion of Heidegger in particular. In a second group of canvases from this period, the co-constituent role of nothingness is replaced within the frame. In this grouping of works, some of which are entitled Facade, the simply drawn figure of the house appears against a vast field of colour. It is variously settled at the base of the canvas, as in this work, or at the edge, pushed towards the edge of the picture, or occasionally cast ungrounded within the centre of the painting. The facade, a figuratively comprehensible image, is paired with an expansive painterly field that is decisively non-representational. In producing these landscapes, Schendel simultaneously asserts and undermines the practice of representation. There is some kind of tear between depiction, confined to the small, recognisable figure of a house, and abstraction within the proportionally greater painterly field. The building facade, as Tanya mentioned earlier, is a motif that appeared within Schendel's earlier works on canvas and was part of the focus of her first solo exhibition in Sao Paulo at the MASPI in 1954. Schenberg reviewed her work in 1964, an exhibition at the Galleria Astrea in Sao Paulo, and cites the importance of Schendel's interest in Oriental aesthetics to the development of her painting over the past decade, and in particular, her depiction of the symbol theme of the house, from its earliest 1954 appearance to the works he termed ontological landscapes. Schendel discerns how the figure alternates from a, as he calls it, occidental existential sense of the house as a closed, isolated, crowded symbol to what he terms an Eastern cosmovision, the house opened towards a fathomless expanse. Schenberg's manner of reading Schenberg's, their names are too similar. Schenberg's manner of reading Schendel's paintings continues through his approach to the monotypias. His writings on these works are distinctive in their identification of different schemes of representation contained within this series. In published and unpublished writings, he draws out and distinguishes different series within the series and emphasizes the different philosophical preoccupations held by each. He also emphasizes the singularity of each image. Each drawing, he comments, has, in the Bergsonian sense, a specific duration, which determines the essential nature of its space. In concentrating on examples that include different types of drawn line, for example, he observes how this is a good example. He observes how heavier drawn lines convey a slow rhythm and finely drawn lines a greater velocity. In this way, the artist's line is transformed from a transient gesture into an enduring symbol of the type of duration or time it represents. This reading of her lines is used by Schenberg to decipher the concern of certain monotypias with rendering music visual, for example, with transforming sound into an image of sound. Reflecting his interest in Schendel's generation of new types of image via reconciliation between the abstract and the figurative, he notes how other inscriptions convince and compel by occupying a space between figurative resemblance, abstract line, and linguistic sign. In this, Schenberg is particularly drawn to the handwritten, hand-drawn anthropomorphic letter A, which appears across the monotypias, reappears within the Objetos Gráficos and later series of works on paper. You can see it here in one of the examples of the Objetos Gráficos, or graphic objects. For Mario Schenberg, the thing that he's drawn to is this figure A's surprising synthesis, its three-sidedness as a sign, letter, figure. It's a letter that is a letter, but also a human figure, and also an expression of a certain duration, making it in some a dynamic image of embodied thought. In similarity with her schematic landscapes, he is interested too in how this A is propelled forward on the space of a plane as a quasi-diagrammatic articulation of a certain worldview or a certain understanding of being. These, he suggests, are closer to an articulation of a mode of being inherent to Occidental modernity than to his interest in Eastern aesthetics. The figure A as it appears, is often isolated within the white space of the monotype drawing. And for Schenberg, the A's spoke of the depersonalization of modern man, cut off from any deep bonds with other people and nature. Even when linked or grouped, they seemed to Schenberg as soldiers in a purely mechanical order of non-communicating beings. This is in some ways a persuasive interpretation, especially when compared to how the anthropomorphic A appears when transformed by its relationship to the horizon line between mountain and sky in the later series of Itachaya landscapes. Schenberg's reading of both Schendel's paintings and the monotypias amplifies their legibility. As a reader of Schendel's work, he articulates his own path of thinking. It's a particular relationship that opens her work to the possibility of it being read within a philosophical tradition. This form of engagement pulls her work in an alternative direction to that demanded by a historiography that's bounded by a logic of formal progression. From this viewpoint, neither Schendel's images on canvas nor those contained within the monotypias can be isolated within an analysis that is concerned solely with their position relative to a sliding scale from painting towards sculpture. A reconsideration of Schendel's painting, in particular, from the point of view of their reading by Schenberg, therefore has certain implications for how we might now place her work within a history of art. In this, Schenberg acts as one example of how the establishment of a productive and mutually transformative dialogue was of central importance to the process of Schendel's work. Both within and beyond the Sao Paulo milieu, Schendel consistently sought out interlocutors, and her partners in dialogue included, as mentioned, Willem Flusser, Max Benz, Jean Gebser, and Hermann Schmitz. A plural history of Schendel's work could be formed from her relationships to and readings by others, composed of multiple threads and formative relationships of differing durations. Such a pattern, in fact, resonates with the formally discontinuous pattern of her work, with its constant loops and returns, more convincingly than the reduced view offered by considering her trajectory in terms of a progression from picture plane to object. Thank you.